G'day fellas, welcome back to another Age of Empires 4 video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at every single unit that you've got access in the game, with the exception of unique units. We're going to look at how they stack up, what they counter, what counters them. Let's get right to it. So we're going to be starting off with the very early stages of the game. So in your game you're going to be able to have access to the Spearman. Okay, now the Spearman, it is your standard pike unit. He's going to be very effective against horsemen. Okay, now these are both age 2 units, feudal age units. Okay, so these the Spearman does in fact counter the horseman. So the horseman, it works, you would be very familiar with the system. The horseman in turn counters the archer, and then of course the archer counters the spearman. So it just works like that. But let's talk a little bit more, because some of these countering systems are not necessarily conventional, and it is the first time that we have seen some of them in Age of Empires. So as an example, in the top right hand corner of the screen, you can see we've got light units and heavy units. So this is basically talking about their armor type. So as an example, we have the knight, okay, which has a high base armor. So the knight has a base armor of 4. Exactly the same as this guy right here, the men-at-arms. He has got a high base armor. So if you want to counter this unit, there's a specific type of unit that you would make, and that's this guy right here. It's the crossbow. So the crossbow is an anti-armor specialist, and that's exactly what you're going to need for this situation. Now, there's a lot of other factors as well that you can consider, but the most important thing to remember is that in this situation, if you're going up against armored units, you want to be creating crossbows. Once you get to the late game, you're going to be able to create this guy right here, the hand cannon. The hand cannon is very similar, except he does all of his damage just up front. He doesn't have any bonuses, so he's very effective against these units as well. And to be honest, I've found quite a lot of difficulty in dealing with hand cannons in the late game. They can be very, very difficult to deal with once a mass is built up and there is appropriate anti-siege that your enemy has got. It becomes really, really difficult. So let's talk more about the early game. So what can you do if your opponent is making men-at-arms very, very early in the game? Let's say they're playing the Holy Roman Empire and you're up against maybe 7 or 8 men-at-arms. What can you do? Now, technically, the counter to this is a combination of horsemen together with archers. So the idea is that you need to have probably about 10 or 11 archers just in case to be able to pick off spears. And then the horsemen should technically be able to deal with the men-at-arms because of their charge. So they have a high damage charge, which is going to bypass a lot of the armor. When I say bypass it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to look at it or it's going to negate it. But you need to think about armor from the perspective of, okay, if this guy right here deals 5 damage and this guy's got 4 armor, well, he's only going to deal 1 damage. But if this guy here has got a charge that does, say, 20 damage, and this guy's still got 4 armor, now you're doing 16 damage to him with that. So that's where it sort of comes into bypassing the armor, if that makes sense. His armor is a lot less effective against large attacks. And part of the reason why against those armored units in the late game, we see that that all-important, let me move them back over there, we see that all-important hand cannoneer. Keep in mind the hand cannoneer is a very expensive unit. You know, you're not going to be able to fill out your entire army full of hand cannoneers, even though I would love to be able to do that. They're just way too expensive, but they're both very effective counters to that. So your enemy is, you know, looking to do some sort of early push against you. Let's say they're going to throw out some battering rams, and they've got a whole bunch of, what have they got? They've got a whole bunch of archers. How are you going to deal with that? So your first thought is, okay, well, I'm going to be making horsemen, okay? And the horsemen are going to be able to deal with the archers, and then I can siege down the battering rams after. Well, that works, and that is definitely the right choice, but it's probably going to be even more difficult if they also just include a couple of spears in there, because now they very effectively counter you. So there's a couple of different ways that you can go about it if you like your chances against them. So that's assuming that they're not English, okay? Then there's no reason why you too can't also be massing up archers, okay? And when it comes to dealing with this guy right here, the battering ram, I don't actually have it listed here, but what you can do is you can utilize your villagers. When your enemy gets in underneath your town center, you can start to siege down their battering ram with your villagers. But the alternative is, if you don't want to do that, is that you would be also going for spears as well. You can do a combination of these two. In the early game, it definitely feels to be the stronger composition is the spear combined with the bow. However, that does go out the window, I will say that, for civilizations that have got access to the early knight. If you can get this combo right here, this is one of the best combos in the early game. If you've got access to this in the second age, you're going to be very easily able to out-micro your enemy and really punish them, because the main issue is if you've got horsemen available to you in the second age instead of the knight, then what's going to be happening is your horsemen are going to be getting shot at by the enemy archers. So it's incredibly important that you do your best to try and keep them back, but at the same time, that's why the knight is so strong, because it is armored. It's going to be very effective against that. Let's talk a little bit more about siege though, and what you can do up against your opponent. Let's say that they've potentially looked at walling themselves in the early game. What's the best way for you to go about sieging through it? Well, the truth is that there is any of these units, the melee infantry as well as the cavalry units, are going to be acceptable. But your standard is going to be just a battering ram, is very effective against walls, because typically your enemy is going to be putting a whole bunch of archers behind it, and you're not going to be able to do too much. If your opponent's got a whole bunch of walls and archers, you're not going to be able to get, say, scouts in there to begin sieging down that wall. So it's very important to consider that. Once it gets into the mid game and your opponent starts using stone walls, that's when it's going to get a little bit more tricky. You can still use battering rams, but you can also use siege towers as well. Siege towers are good at bypassing the walls, but at the same time, it's still not going to be an effective tool to actually breach through. So your best bet for breaking through these walls is if you're in the third age, the castle age, is to get a trebuchet. If you're in the fourth age, then it would be the bombard is your best bet to go up against any form of defensive structure. So that includes the keep, that includes any kind of towers, any kind of buildings that your enemy is making. You want to be getting out these two guys right here. These guys are going to be very effective against it, but by the same token, you've got to be careful. You know why you got to be careful? Because your enemy may make some culverin, and culverin are very effective at killing artillery. So how do you deal with culverin? Then that's a great question, because the culverin, it's a very interesting unit. It's got very high damage against siege. That's it. So the correct or the appropriate thing would be horsemen. But what I've actually found very effective is scouts. And the reason why scouts are so effective is because, first and foremost, they're cheap. You can get a whole lot of them. You can get, like, say, 10 to 15 scouts if your opponent has got any kind of defensive siege. Let's say that they've got some bombards. Let's say maybe they've got a mangonel or something in there as well. You can actually just run your scouts up because they're fast, they're cheap, and they do the exact same amount of siege damage as every other unit that is here. They've all got torch damage, well, with the exception of the ranged infantry, which shoot from range. But the melee infantry and the cavalry, they all do the same torch damage, the same Molotov damage, whatever you would call it. So it's a very effective counter against these, but it's important to note that the culverin can actually be countered by certain civilizations with their springled. So the springled is a little bit more like an age 3 culverin. It's a very effective unit at focusing down enemy high priority enemy targets. Let's say your enemy hits the third age. Okay, I'll give you guys like a typical rundown of how my games go. All right, I scout out my enemy is opening with an archery range, and I say that's fine. I'm going to open with my own town center, and I'm going to open with my own archery range as well. And then I might see some spears out from my enemy, and still at this point, I'm feeling absolutely fine. I'm just going to continue building up my archers. Maybe think about going to the third age myself, but then my enemy hits the third age. And now what my concern is that my enemy is going to start making mangonels. Because if my enemy makes mangonels, he is going to completely crush my army. There's absolutely nothing I can do to this. So what do I do to deal with that? I need to get up to the third age myself, and then I make springalds. Springalds are very effective at dealing with the mangonels of your enemy. They're very ineffective against wolves. They're ineffective against, smaller targets like archers or spears, but they're effective against those high priority targets like knights because they bypass so much of that armor. They've got very high damage. It's burst damage. It just hits them once. It's single target. I think it actually does go through other targets that are in front of the target that you're shooting, but it is very, very effective. There's also a range upgrade that you can get. I think it's called Roller Shutters, which is available for the Springald, which also increases the range. So the range of them is significantly higher than the Mangonel. So that's something that is going to be very common for you to have to deal with. So throughout the game, typically, once it gets to the late game especially, you're going to be seeing enemies massing up hand cannons, Streltsy, crossbows, whatever it is, what are they called? Archulabias? Arbalatrias. There we go, Arbalatrias. So you will see them massing up all of those units, archers as well, because they're typically like the most common base of an army, and the best way to deal with that very effectively is the Mangonel. So you can't use the Culverin because the Culverin is single shot and it works against siege. Bombard is single shot, works against buildings. Trebuchet, it's terrible against units. Springald, it is very good at just shooting like a single target. The Mangonel is what you want. If you can get 3 Mangonels out, that's actually your key number. That's your break point. So 3 Mangonels is going to be enough to kill, I think, pretty much every infantry unit in the game by one-shotting it. So what you want to do is have 3 Mangonels out, and in the late game, when your enemy has got those death balls up, one shot, boom, all gone. So you might think that against hand cannoneers, that because they're a ranged infantry, you might think, oh, okay, well, I'll just make a whole bunch of knights and a whole bunch of horsemen. But the truth is, they absolutely shred. These guys are insane. So if you are having trouble with them, that's going to be your best route. So let's speak just a little bit more about light infantry or light units and heavy units. So if your enemy in the 3rd age is massing up a whole bunch of crossbows, which counter heavy, and then archers as well, which do pretty well against anything, then what is it that you can make to effectively deal with this? So your first thought might be to make this guy right here, the knight. But the problem is the crossbow is going to trade effectively against him. As long as the enemy is microing and they're shooting and scooting, you're going to have a difficult time. So the surprising answer here is to go for the horseman. And the reason why is because the horseman has bonus damage against ranged infantry. Well, I think it's ranged infantry. Yeah, it's ranged infantry. I was going to say light infantry, but it's ranged infantry. So it will do bonus damage against both of these units here. So a really important factor to consider when you're in the late game and you're, or not in the late game, but in the mid game and your enemy is making this. All right, let's talk a little bit more about attacking into an enemy. So let's say your enemy has set up that all-important castle and it's on a really important, a pivotal piece of infrastructure or resource, like a gold mine, something like that. How is the best way for you to tackle that? Do not send any of your units near it. Don't even go close unless it's in construction and you can snipe off the villagers. That's the only reason why you would do it. It's got to be siege. It has to be siege. So your best bet in the 3rd age, as mentioned earlier, the trebuchet. Alternative is the bombard once you get to the late game, but keep in mind these guys are very expensive. I think they're about 600 gold, so you've got to be very careful with them. And those are your best bets. Now, the other alternative is that you can use a ram. Now, when it comes to rams, the way that rams work is actually dependent on the design of the game. So you can't control where your town center or your castle is shooting. And the reason why is because it shoots the closest target. And so that is to actually balance the ram. And so essentially what happens is you can use your rams as cover. So let's say that you're pushing into your enemy, you can get a ram, make sure that it's taking heaps of fire from the castle, and then from that, you can bring in your archers behind that and begin to push in underneath with the ram for cover. So that is one way that you can do it, because there are situations where it becomes more difficult. Let's say, as an example, that you are trying to trebuchet down that castle or that keep, and your enemy has got springalds sitting in there. Well, now with the keep there, they can bring the springalds forward, snipe off at your trebuchet, and then just come back. And then if your trebuchet's dead, it's going to be, that castle's up for another minute longer now because of your trebuchet being sniped off by the springalds. I'm just taking a look and making sure I've covered everything. I think I've covered everything at this point. We're going to be doing unique units in another video because obviously I don't think there would be enough space on this board that we've got here to do unique units. So that'll be things like the Magadai, that'll be like all the unique Chinese units like the Fire Lance, the Grenadier, all those good things. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like. If you think I missed something, please leave a comment and I'll make sure that I try and cover it in the unique unit video as well. And most of all, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching.